Hello, my name is Reshma Radhakrishnan. Before I begin, I want to sincerely thank the organizers for making this arrangement. I very much appreciate the concern and the work that must have gone into this. Thank you very much. I have a PowerPoint presentation, so I will share my screen. Yeah. My paper is titled Trans Women in Kerala, Examining the Disengagements with Gender and Gender Diversities and Differences. I attempt to traverse through the ways in which the queer movement that fundamentally challenges the heteronormative gender binary order on one hand, and the state and the civil society on the other, negotiate with each other in different contexts. Taking the case of trans women of the state of Kerala in South India, I examine the shifts in the past 2 decades of queer activism in the state and try to understand the idea of accommodation. This presentation will be broadly done in 2 sections. In the first, I try to brief the context of the study, and in the second, I engage more closely with the question I ask. The observations I make are based on a qualitative study among the trans women community in Kerala. The relevance of the questions I ask is in the changed social and political context of the present, where the law, the state, and the civil society, in varying degrees and ways, are accommodative of and seemingly more open and sensitive than before to sexual and gender diversities. Let me briefly introduce Kerala. Kerala has a very unique history compared to the other states of the country, which involved long-lasting trade relations with the Europeans, the Arabs, the Middle East, the Jews, the Chinese, and so on, which made it a very multicultural society also with diverse religious practices. It has had a strong communist movement. It has had caste-based reform movements. It has had a history of having matrilineal communities, all of which arguably contributed to the much acclaimed Kerala model of development of the 1970s, which was studied by scholars worldwide. The state showed high development indices despite low, primarily in health and education, despite low economic development. The model was studied and critiqued later for its inability to address caste, community, gender, and other factors. Now, another thing that makes Kerala unique is a complete absence of transgenders, an absolute absence of transgenders in its public spaces, unlike the other states where there are thriving hijra cultures. Now, hijra is the term used by trans women to call themselves in most parts of South Asia, and hijras have very long and rich history. I will not go into the details for want of time at the moment. Now, trans women or hijras are seen on trains and streets and dancing on auspicious occasions of like heterosexual marriages and so on. And that's a very common sight in almost all parts of India except Kerala. Scholars observe that, I quote, regions like Kerala claimed to be blissfully sanitized from such social aberrations, unquote, until recently. They illustrate how Kerala was tamed to a certain moral standards where the suppressed sexuality was handled through making use of the option of talking of sexuality as masculine and penis-centered. Now about the queer discourse and organizing in Kerala. When I say that trans people are not or were not visible in Kerala, I do not mean that the discourse was absent. There have been studies that effectively argue that a discourse on sexuality was part of the visual and literary culture of post-colonial Kerala. However, it was only around the year 2000 that people actually started organizing themselves on the basis of sexuality and alternative sexual and gender identities. There were 2 triggers to this. One was the newspaper reports on suicide of women couples, which led to the formation of a rights-based organization called Sahayatrika, and 2, the HIV/AIDS intervention programs. Although the latter basically was centered around condom distribution, the programs gave a sense of acknowledgement to sections of queer people whose existence was hitherto disregarded. The many community-based organizations formed across the state helped the MSM population, or the men who have sex with men, as they were then labeled. So it helps them, the CBOs, the community-based organizations, helps them network with each other to basically meet and socialize. Criminalization and extreme forms of violence and discrimination continued, resulting in many queer people migrating into the bustles of nearby metropolis, some committing suicide, and most living closeted lives, succumbing to the violence and pressures of the heteronormative society. Sahatrika, with its very limited resources, helped people survive and sometimes fight court cases. Until 2009, for about a decade, Kerala's queer organizing took place in such hostile atmosphere and involved fighting police violence, trying to create awareness through workshops, seminars, court cases, discussions, so on and so forth. Now, among other civil society groups, feminist groups also have not been open to discussions on sexuality until recently. Scholars have observed that the feminist movement worked with a strikingly heterosexist framework. Queer activists writing about the relationship between the feminist movement and the queer movement of Kerala as having been not an easy one validates this. Now, between 2009 and 2019, there were many court cases and very important verdicts, judgments. That's a lot of information on one slide, and so the slide is a bit clumsy, so I have highlighted the positive judgments in yellow. So after the 2009 judgment, Kerala and many other cities in India had their first Queer Pride celebrations in 2010. The immediate years that followed tried to fight the fall in enthusiasm due to ambiguities connected to the court verdicts, nevertheless putting up very strong political statements through annual pride parades, giving representations consistently to the government, negotiating with public health systems, fighting discrimination on a day-to-day basis, most of which were ignored and trivialized. Following the 2014 verdict of the Supreme Court that recognized transgenders as third genders, trans people, trans women in particular, began to be seen appearing in public spaces without having to try and hide their gender identity. Although there were discomforts and disagreements with the term third gender, the judgment changed the lives of many trans people of Kerala. Both the state and civil society took an abrupt U-turn in favor of transgenders. Kerala turned out to be the first state in the country to draft a transgender policy. Interviews of trans women conducted by known feminists started appearing in mainstream publications. A trans woman co-starred in a feature film with the most popular leading Malayalam actor. Another trans woman appeared as a cover girl of a leading women's magazine. The ruling centrist government at the time, led by the Indian National Congress Party, and later the left government, led by the Communist Party of India Marxist, took great interest in the case of transgenders. Ranging from special budget allocations for welfare of transgenders, to creating a separate gender column in application forms, to arranging for coordination of safe and subsidized sex reassignment surgery, the government took up the concerns. Transgender justice boards at state levels and district levels were set up. Transgender cell is in place to implement the welfare measures. Scholarships were announced for and given for education. While the stigma and distancing and even harassment of trans people ironically continue on one side, on the other, transgender individuals are seen to be joining colleges for higher studies and in their chosen identity, which was never ever the case. They are given membership in student and youth wings of mainstream political parties, etc., making news across the world and so on. Suddenly, trans women were everywhere. What makes this possible? Did the court rulings clear the way for all of these, leading to a complete turnaround? Now with this, I go to the next part of my presentation, which is the basis of this paper. The central question that I ask, how do we understand the sudden changes, basically accommodation, and the unprecedented shift in the perception of state and civil society towards transgenders? For my fieldwork, I met with some of the popular trans women. By this, I mean those trans women who have become iconic figures over the past few years, celebrity spokespersons representing the community and their struggles. Some of them have very actively been part of the movement long before 2009 also, while some others made an entry to the public domain very recently. I used the excerpts from the interviews conducted by me in the paper, as well as those from interviews available in public domain, published either in print media or visual digital media. And I also use some other speeches and interviews available in public domain. However, for want of time, I have to decide to make minimal to no use of excerpts from the interviews in this presentation at the risk of not being able to bring in the richness of the ethnographic material. I also use the footage of a beauty pageant for transgenders, trans women, held for the first time in 2017 and yearly thereafter, organized by Dwaya Arts and Charitable Society. That's the name of an organization, Dwaya Arts and Charitable Society, an initiative of a few popular trans women. So yeah, that's another material that I have used in my analysis. Now, as is always the case, the takeaway from the field was different from and beyond what one had anticipated. I went to the field to understand the strategy of the state and civil society groups in accommodating transgenders through conversations and interactions with the latter. I learned that the shift that I had been seeking to understand has not only been in terms of or as responses from state or civil society. There has been a shift in the vocabulary of political activism of the transgender movement as well under the changed circumstances. The movement has made a clear shift from an assertion of differences to a desire for normalcy. From asserting their identities, from asserting the idea of gender fluidity, and thus challenging the gender binary model, the shift is towards trying to fit in to the existing norms, which are ironically homophobic and rooted in the gender binary model. The increasing number of trans weddings and the manner in which these are performed, I argue, are indicative of the desire for such validations of normalcy in a homophobic gender binary society. The responses evoked from the heteronormative society are often appreciative of the real womanliness of the bride and real manliness of the groom. So one often comes across such remarks in the comment section of the videos of some of these trans weddings that grabbed a lot of media attention and are available on public domain. I argue that it is the new approach from the side of the movement, which is the coherence with the normative tabled by the transgender and or genderqueer people, or the sameness projected rather, and not the challenges or differences that get accommodated, or perhaps to be more apt, that get assimilated. Not surprisingly, this approach is more worthwhile for a community for which being political is seldom a matter of choice. Whether this is done by design or not, this is happening, is my argument. What happens to the political project of reforming the heteronormative society is perhaps then a question for the more privileged ones in that society to ask themselves. Now, I look forward to making a more detailed presentations with a lot of views of excerpts from my fieldwork, if possible, in the coming year, if there's a chance at the conference. Thank you all very much for listening. Thank you.